This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien starts the show with his grain market update. He discusses why we have low grain prices and what it would take to change them. Jeff Whitworth, K-State crop entomologist, continues today's show as he explains what soybean pests he is currently keeping an eye on in fields. Wrapping up today's show is K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond with his weather update that highlights the variability across the state and if he expects it to continue. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned into Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update from K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. Daniel, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
Daniel, for the grain market, currently seeing some low grain prices, and why is that?
Well, we have every presumption in the market that we'll have large crops. And even though usage has been pretty good in a number of sectors, particularly for corn, for exports, ethanol not bad, some other factors, not wheat until just recently doing pretty good export-wise, soybeans, a fairly decent crush. Even with all that, the narrative of the market is at this time is to pay attention to crop size and still expecting large crops for corn, for soybeans. We've already had a large crop for wheat, and we really don't see any factors changing that. There's been some uncertainty and questions also about what impact tariff discussions that the U.S. has had with various countries, what that will have on trade. And still the big uncertain figure out there, particularly for soybean market, has to do with how U.S. and China tariff discussions will work out, again, with the idea that China might come back in pretty strong on the soybean market and or the grain sorghum market. We'll see. Anyway, either way, you got a combination of production factors and geopolitical factors in play that are being responded to in a very, I guess, if you're talking about the size of crops, a very, very positive way. If you're looking at the outcome of large supplies and growing supply-demand balances, you're looking at factors that would put a damper on prices going down the road. There are other factors to consider. Again, it's now August 1st, and we can talk about the significance of that going forward if you'd like.
And you mentioned that we're expecting large crops. When you say that, are you meaning for just Kansas or for other states as well?
Really for all states in the United States. When you look at drought monitor maps, and when we hear from Chip Redmond and others here in our shop here at K-State, I don't see a lot of concern around the nation. In fact, almost all places show quite a bit of moisture, except depending on which map you're looking at, some of the parts of Illinois, Indiana, and up into Michigan, a little bit of Ohio showing some long-term dryness. I hear, along with Chip, other respected climatologists talking about pockets of dryness in some very important corn and soybean growing areas. But overall, the presumption of the market is that, we're sitting here on August 1st. We haven't had a drought overall, so we're presuming it to the high side at this moment.
Is there a scenario where producers can still have a good crop and high prices?
Yes, that would be very much dependent on strong usage. You've got a combination of factors in these supply-demand balance sheets. If you come into a marketing year, again, the one that you finished up in the past, you've got really, really low beginning stocks. Anticipate often other countries, either due to geopolitical reasons or droughts in South America or other major crop production regions, that you'll have strong usage, strong exports, strong domestic usage. Then you could see a situation where we have sizable crops, again, 15 billion bushel plus corn, 4.2, 4.3 billion or 4 billion bushel soybeans in the U.S., but then have ending stocks for corn, say around 1.5 billion bushels or less, for soybeans, something like 250 million bushels or less, or for wheat, Again, similar situation, although we haven't had it for a bit in wheat, where you'd be looking at something closer to 500 million bushels or less. Then yes, you could see, even with large supplies, you could have tightening stocks because of really good usage and end up with decent prices. But, that's not what we're looking at right now in 2025 heading into 26.
As we're talking about these low prices, anything notable when we look at the futures or cash?
On the cash market side, it's interesting. Again, you and I watch this on a weekly basis, and the emergence of Southeast Kansas in the last week as having really, really strong prices. And you look at when we look at listings of cash, when I look at cash grain bids, we try to report the highest price, and often you'll get a terminal or something near an ethanol plant or a soybean crush plant, not the plant itself, but for elevators nearby, you'll see a really high price, and that price might be 20, 30 cents higher than other elevators around it. And in that mode, you're having an in and out charge coming from the other elevators to these major terminals. That said, I look at Southeast Kansas. The corn price for yesterday's closes, $4.09 top price, and then for harvest $4.18. That 409 compares to 404 in Garden City, and normally Garden City is pretty much been our standard bearer for high cash corn prices. The new crop bid in the Garden City area is still higher, 424 versus that 418. But when you look across the rest of the state, the highest prices that are available everywhere else in the Northwest Kansas, North Central, Northeast, South Central, they're all well below $4. So you have these two areas really providing pretty strong price leadership for corn, and the others really reflecting the anticipation of large harvests coming on, even though it's only August 1st. And you do see a similar situation, again, Southeast Kansas, gracious. The strongest grain sorghum bid is at $3.97, and as a cash price for sorghum here in Kansas, there's nothing else. Well, $3.59, a lot of them closer to just say $3.09, $3.10. So you have that situation. Again, a strong head-turning bid for sorghum bids at, say, $4.17. Again, in that southeast area around Pittsburgh, Kansas, and really no other forward bid above $3.74. So Southeast Kansas really standing out. You do see more, I guess, not quite as much disparity for soybeans, but again, Southeast Kansas bid for beans, and they have a new soybean crush plant down there, $9.99. Nothing else above $9.74, and that being in Topeka, which arguably is probably influenced by Southeast Kansas. But then for wheat, the strongest cash bid, South Central Kansas near Hutchinson, about $5.25. Then Pittsburgh also coming in again, one strong bid, $5.31. So you got that Southeast, South Central Kansas activity going on. And other prices in western Kansas closer to $4.50, $4.60, and so you've got some price differentials. When we talk about these price differences, that's what people that have grain trucks pay attention to. If they happen to be close enough to those areas, they can arbitrage those differences, but they have to pay the transportation cost to get it there to force these markets together. And at this time, especially with wheat, we have quantities of wheat around the countryside. You've got forces that are kind of holding the wheat market down. Well, I know we have lower price situations right now, but if we have time, I'd like to speak a little bit about what the probabilities are for an alternative outcome. So for corn, you look at the current situation, what the USDA just projected in July, probably a coin flip, about 50% chance they're right, but still that you've got a pretty high yield there, and probably about a 45% chance of something a little bit less, 1 or 2 bushels lower at about 179 bushels an acre. You run that through the supply-demand balance sheet, that'd make about a 40-cent difference on the price if we got something like that. Instead of 420, the USDA is projecting about 460. And you look for soybeans, again, the USDA is projected in this July report, about 52.5 bushels an acre. If that's 51 bushels an acre, and still it's only August, it's only just the beginning of August, that could come into play. But if you go from 52.5 to 51, still a very good U.S. yield. You're looking at something like instead of 310 million bushels down to 244, 245, and a price working its way through about, instead of $10.10 like the USDA, 10 cents a bushel like the USDA has projected, you're looking at $1 or more gain from just that much of a change. So really, soybeans are more on the edge in terms of supply-demand balances than really corn is, and we're coming into the time frame when that's at issue. I'll just say real quickly, the USDA, when they report in their August 12th report, they'll be looking at what farmers tell them via electronic, mail, phone call surveys, what they think they have in the field today, August 1st. And generally, we don't hear a lot of pessimism on farmers' part. Would not be surprised that number comes in pretty strong. We really won't have the USDA out into the fields or being a month closer to the harvest till we get to the September survey. So I don't know that I'd be real optimistic in the short term that we'll have any solid data from the USDA that has the potential to support prices more or support markets. But we'll see where things go. A lot's going to depend on weather and how trade, usage, and other factors all work out in the grain markets.
How accurate usually are those reports?
The average trade error of forecast for the July numbers is for corn, it's about 500 million bushels or so. And the biggest error they've ever had, they missed by 2 billion bushels. Of course, I think that was a late set of crop issues at tough weather in July. For soybeans, 136 million bushels is their average miss, and the largest they've ever had as a miss off of the July numbers that we have is about 430 million. And as you go into July and August, not that much different. So on average, we miss by about 500 million bushels for corn and about 135, 150 for soybeans. But we'll see where it goes.
Daniel, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby. I appreciate it.
That was K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today. We continue our Friday show discussing soybean pests with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure. Anytime, Chevy, and welcome to the program.
Jeff, what specific pests do you anticipate soybean growers needing to be prepared for this season?
The agronomists always say that August is the month to make beans, the yield, because that's the time you need to get moisture. But August is also the time when a lot of the beans are reaching the reproductive stages, and there are 3 pests, 2 that we habitually have problems with, and 1 that we haven't thought about for quite a while. And that, first of all, I'd like to mention the soybean aphid. The soybean aphid is an invasive pest. It comes into Kansas every year since about 2002 or 2003, the first time we've noticed it. They haven't really caused a problem, maybe 2 years in the 22, 23 years that we've had soybean aphids. But those 2 years, they did cause quite a bit of concern, at least. The thing about the soybean aphid, they don't do well in hot conditions. And so fortunately in Kansas, in July and August, when they're migrating into the state, we do have really hot conditions. But this year, and looking at the forecast for the next maybe week or 10 days, it looks like we're going to have some cool temperatures. These things generally come in from, anytime we get north breezes, they seem to migrate in on the north wind. So the last few days we've had some north breezes. I have seen a couple of soybean aphids. I've not seen any colonies yet, but I just thought since it's been several years since we really had a problem with them, I would notify everybody that it's going to be, if the temperatures are only in the 80s for the next 2 or 3 weeks, just be careful and check for soybean aphids. They are aphids, which means they reproduce parthenogenically, which means their colonies can just explode quite quickly. The easiest way, and the way I found these already this year, is by finding ants. If you find ants on soybean leaves in the top of a colony, you've got aphids someplace, because the ants are up there looking for the honeydew that the aphids are producing. The thing about the soybean aphid, that's the only aphid that colonizes on soybeans. So if you have some little ones with a big one, and I say big, that's relative. Even the adults are really small. But if you have some relatively larger ones and small ones, that means they're colonizing. and that probably means they're soybean aphids. They'll be on the underside of a leaf. I really don't think we're going to have much problem, but just as these beans are getting into the reproductive stages, if it does stay cool, keep an eye out for the soybean aphid. The other two pests we have every year, and that is the bean leaf beetle and the soybean podworm. And we have an abundance of bean leaf beetles right now, the adults. I think they're still mostly in the larval stage, which means we're going to have more adults coming on in the next, a week or 2 weeks. But the problem with the bean leaf beetle is they're often misidentified with the southern corn rootworm adult. It's very important you distinguish the two. The bean leaf beetle adult, there's two different color phases, a red color phase and a greenish tan color phase. But they both have a black border around the outside of the wings, where the southern corn rootworm does not. Sometimes it's called the spotted corn rootworm or the 12-spotted, cucumber beetle. It can go by other names, but it's the southern corn rootworm. And they will be out in soybean fields, and there can be thousands of them in certain places, but they're not causing damage to the soybean as opposed to the bean leaf beetle adult. They can feed on the foliage, but the real problem, in my mind at least, is they will feed on the pods. And so when they start feeding on the pods, they're starting to damage the marketable product. So if they're feeding on the pods, they're opening up that bean or that seed, whatever you want to call it, to desiccation or something else feeding on it, or, pathogens, so they can reduce your yield relatively quickly. Now, they're going to feed on those pods as long as there's green pods in that field. And then you have the podworm. It's very important. You get out and look. If you have damage on the pods only just right where the seed is, there's 3 seeds per pod. So if you have a hole right where one seed is, or 2 or 3, and that's all, no damage on the pods, just right where the bean is, that's corn earworm larvae or soybean podworm larvae. If you're out and you're scouting and you're looking and you don't find any larvae, you just find the holes, don't treat. That means they're through feeding and they're in the soil pupating. So to treat now, you missed the window of opportunity to treat. You want to get out and find them when the worms are really small. So if all you're finding are the holes where the worm has eaten the seed, just hold off, because they'll be pupating in the soil, and they'll pupate for 4 or 5 days, and then they'll come out as an adult moth, and they will mate, and then they will lay eggs, and it takes 4 or 5 days for the eggs to hatch. So you're looking at 10 to 14 days before the larvae are out there feeding again. So if you spray when you're out there and you just find holes but you don't find any larvae, that insecticide is going to dissipate before it's actively needed on the new larvae as they come on. And if your beans have progressed far enough where there aren't too many green succulent pods, the adult moths may fly over a sorghum field or a later planted bean field or someplace else to lay their eggs. So that's why monitoring is so very important. But if you're out there and you do find either one early on, while they're just starting to, the adults or bean leaf beetles are just starting to feed on your pods, or the worms are just starting to feed on the seed, it's critical that you make a decision whether you need to treat or not. Generally, one worm or one adult feeding on the pods or feeding on the seeds per row foot. That's kind of what we use as a treatment threshold. Now, that kind of varies based upon, the maturity of the crop and other things, but they can actually reduce your yield quite quickly because, remember, they're feeding right on the marketable product. They're not feeding on the leaves or anything else. So it's that time of year. As a lot of the beans get into the reproductive stages, it becomes critical that we get moisture and we get out and we scout for these pests also, because now's the time when you can make yield, or if you have a pest problem, you can lose yield.
So if you do have some of these problems with soybean pests, how do you treat it?
One of the keys to treating anything with an insecticide or a herbicide or whatever is timing. The weed scientists will tell you want to treat weeds when they're small, right? If you have a bacterial infection, you want to treat it when it's early. If you have a fungal infection, you want to treat it early. It's exactly the same thing with insects. That's why monitoring is so very important. Get out and look. You want to catch that infestation early on. So it's all about timing, but it's also about using the right amount of carrier. The insecticides that we test every year or periodically are available on the K-State website, the entomology website. You can go there and look up pesticide efficacy trials and pick out the one that looked best in your area and all that kind of stuff. But the thing that I just have recently started doing in the last 2 or 3 years is varying the amount of carrier or the amount of water that you use. These insecticides, for the most part, are contact insecticides, which means they have to contact the pest. And if you stop to think about when you're spraying a soybean canopy, the canopy is pretty thick. A lot of these pests are down in the canopy because that's where it's shaded, and they're feeding down there. So if you spray from the ground or from the air, that insecticide, in order to work, has to get to where the insect is. Anytime we do efficacy trials, we use at least 10 gallons per acre because we're testing the efficacy of the insecticide, not the amount of water. So in the last 3 or 4 years, I've varied the amount of carrier. And I realize I've just been to some demonstrations with drones and robots, and they're using less and less carrier and more focused applications. You know, I'm not sure how that's going to work. I hope it works out. We're trying to do some nanotechnology where we're doing some changing of the product to get more efficacy out of less product. So everybody's trying to do that, but we'll see. But the main thing is timing and make sure you use proper gallonage to get it to where the insects are.
If growers aren't exactly sure maybe what pests that they are experiencing in their crop, what should they do or who should they contact?
Now, we have a Kansas State Soybean Insect Pest Management Guide that's available. You can download for free, or you can go to your extension agent and get that. It describes the different pests, and it gives you an up-to-date list of the insecticides that are currently registered or labeled for whatever pests you're interested in. Or we do have a book, Crop Pests of Kansas, which gives you pictures, and that's another, in my opinion, really good reference for all of our crop insect pests in Kansas. Again, that's available through the K-State bookstore.
Is there anything else that growers should be aware of during the season?
I just got one call about spider mites on soybeans, and I do not like spider mites, period, because they can be really tough. Spider mites we generally think of only causing problems during dry conditions. And you know, anytime we have dry conditions, anytime we have a pest, it exacerbates the damage that pest can cause because the plant's struggling with moisture stress also. So you just have two different kinds of stress. But spider mites is something to be on the lookout for. Hopefully, if it keep getting moisture, they won't bother the crops too much. We're always going to have some. We generally think of spider mites causing more damage on corn in southwest Kansas, but I've seen them cause some problems with soybeans, throughout the state. So that's another thing to be on the lookout for. Other than that, right now, we're in pretty good shape.
Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Anytime.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll have more for you up ahead.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Chip, as we look at the weather for this past week, a lot of variation in precipitation across the state?
A lot of variation in precipitation. You know, we talked last week, we were concerned about potential for flooding rains and some impressive rain totals, and that's what we got. We got some really aggressive rain totals in parts of the Flint Hills and eastward into Kansas City, even as far southwest as points such as Meade County and Clark County. Rain this time of year is a good thing. We need it. Unfortunately, for some folks, some of those rain totals were just too much over a short period of time. Our Butler County station recorded around 6 inches of rain for the period, and you get further north and east, we had 4 inches in Miami County, and just some really heavy rain amounts in some localized areas. But there also were some losers in the last 7 days, where southwest Kansas starting to grow a drier period here, and they haven't had really any real measurable rain for over 2 weeks now in portions of Garden City and points west and south from there. So kind of a bipolar weather environment. And when we talk about late summer, we're really dependent on those thunderstorms, and we just have less complexes that develop and move across the state. We start getting more kind of pop up and little cells that meander, and where they train over the same area, we're going to get higher localized totals. But then areas around that are going to remain dry, and that's what we're seeing. The good news is we had some pretty good drought improvements across the state this week. We had some removal of abnormally dry conditions in both north central Kansas as well as portions of northwest Kansas as well. And that brought our drought monitor conditions to some of the best conditions we've seen in several weeks, with very minimal severe drought, D2, that's just located just a little bit in north central, northwest Kansas along the Nebraska border, and just a couple little blobs of abnormally dry as well. So we're down to 85% of the state is drought-free. There's no drought at all. And that's the best we've seen since really over a year ago, when we've had persistent drought that kind of kept expanding, and then we make small improvements and expand some more. And overall, we've seen general improvement in drought conditions across the state.
Chip, what are we seeing for the forecast?
The forecast is much, much cooler, almost refreshing as we get into the weekend. Temperatures, boy, we're going to struggle to get into the 80s. We're going to see even some areas in north central Kansas could see lows overnight in the upper 50s Saturday morning. And that is delightful after we've had 100-degree days and dew points upwards of 80 degrees with high humidity. So big improvements temperature-wise. That's because we had a cold front come through middle of the week that brought that much cooler air from the north. The cold front's going to shift back northward this weekend on Sunday and into Monday. And what that's going to do is bring another round of showers and storms. Again, I think they'll be pretty spotty. Looks like the chance is pretty widespread across most of the state, with about a quarter to a half inch of rain favored for most places. Could see some localized heavier amounts, and I think a lot of places will still miss out. And then as we move into the week, or midweek next week, we have high pressure build in the southwestern United States. And that's going to result in expansion of warmer conditions north and east into Kansas and drier conditions. That's going to cut off our moisture source, which has been the southwest United States. And with that cutoff, the question is, how long is this high pressure going to last? And there's a lot of uncertainty moving forward. Some of the models keep this till the end of August. And I know we were really uncertain about recent pattern changes and kind of had some models really flip-flop recently with heat and then rain instead of heat and vice versa. It looks like pretty good confidence that at least stay dry in the middle of August at the very least, and the potential for maybe a much warmer, drier period to persist maybe even into September.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.